This morning, my question, will the trial of George Zimmerman show how post-racial we aren't? Plus, the portrayal of black women in reality shows and film. And advice from the extraordinary Myrlie Evers on how to protect voting rights. But first, it's Nerdland from New Orleans! Good morning, I'm Melissa Harris Perry, live from the Essence Festival in my home city of New Orleans. Essence Magazine, the premier magazine for African American women, has been hosting this festival in New Orleans for almost 20 years, and it regularly attracts hundreds of thousands of people. This weekend is a celebration of African American music, Beyonce, hey girl, and culture. We have an incredible amount to get to this morning. But first, we want to bring you the latest on the important international news still developing out of Egypt. For that, let me bring in from Cairo, NBC's Ayan Mohidin. What's happening there in Egypt, Ayan?
Well, the situation right now remains extremely tense across the country, particularly here in Cairo, where health officials say the death toll from overnight clashes between those who supported President Morsi, the ousted President Morsi, and those that opposed him has now reached 30. Now, there was tense fighting not only in Cairo, but also in the city of Alexandria as well. And in between these two rival camps now is building tension. Now, at the core of this debate, obviously, is the military's action that was backed by popular revolt over the course of the last week that ousted the former president. The supporters and mostly the Islamist backers of the former president have been calling this a military coup. They want the former president reinstated. They went to the streets yesterday demanding that the democratically elected leader come back to office. For his part, though, the new interim leader is in the process of trying to form a caretaker government that can get this country back up and running and try to address some of the immediate challenges facing Egypt. Nonetheless, the situation here remains tense as the military now has deployed across the country, as well as additional resources near various presidential buildings where protesters supporting the former president have gathered to try and force the military to bring him back into office. There's no indication that is going to be happening anytime soon, Melissa.
Thank you, Ayman. In Cairo, Egypt, we will keep our eyes on this continuing situation both throughout the day today and tomorrow. But for right now, we are going to bring it back to this incredible festival in New Orleans. It is a celebration of black culture and music. And part of what is really great about the Essence Festival is that it gives us kind of this amazing space to discuss the challenges facing African American communities, and especially African American women. And the big question for women of color right now is how to make the most of the political power that they wielded in the 2012 presidential election. Because make no mistake, women of color won the election for President Obama. That's right, 96% of black women and 3/4 of Latinas voted for President Obama. They are the source of the famous gender gap, making up for white women who actually voted for Mitt Romney by an 8-point margin. And it is those women, the women who are here today at the Essence Festival, who are needed to stop the radical conservative agenda and the all-out assault on women's bodies. But how do we translate our voting power into real change? The problem is politicians on both sides assume that women of color will vote for Democrats, and the Democrats simply take that for granted. And the Republicans write them off as impossible to get. So Republicans feel free to support policies that harm women of color, and Democrats don't feel enough pressure to stop them. Take a look at the latest assault on women's health care, draconian restrictions on reproductive rights in Texas, Ohio, North Carolina, the U.S. House of Representatives that will disproportionately affect poor and minority women. What we need is a coalition, broad and strong, that includes groups that the parties don't want to lose, can't afford to lose. That is how we fight back. And the progressive movement needs women, especially women of color. And we need them now. Joining me now are Vanessa K. Bush, acting managing editor of Essence Magazine, Louisiana State Senator Karen Carter Peterson, chair of the Louisiana Democratic Party, Anthea Butler, Africana Studies professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and of course, friend of Nerdland, and Alex Wagner, host of Now with Alex Wagner here on MSNBC. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having us. Thanks, Melissa.
So, Alex, I want to start with you. What do we do with a coalition of of women who we know showed up in part because President Obama was at the top of that ticket. How do we get that coalition out in 2014 and in 2016?
Well, Mitt Romney was certainly an energizer insofar as everybody looked at him and thought that can't be the man that sits at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I think what's happening, you're seeing the Republican Party at a real crisis and a crossroads on both the national level and the state level. And I actually think the national level is what we pay attention to a lot in the media in terms of Congress and the debates they have and the panels they have featuring all white males talking about women's issues.
Yep.
And that certainly in and of itself is enough to, I think, get people at least outraged.
Yep.
But what is happening at the state level across the country, whether it's through defunding Planned Parenthood, whether it's through transvaginal ultrasounds, there is an ongoing battle taking place in state houses across this country that has dramatic repercussions for women, but really especially women of color.
Yeah, and you know, I always want to sort of remind folks that the kinds of policies that we're seeing right now, if you have a private OBGYN and you have private health insurance, then you just go to your physician and can have a first trimester abortion with very little trouble, right? When they shut down clinics, what that does is to impact poor women, teenagers, you know, women of color who may not have access to health insurance. And black women are turning out at 70%. In the 2012 election, black women turned out 70% of us turned out to vote. Is there any possibility that in 2014 we can return people to polls at that level?
Well, absolutely. If you figure out that now, let's take Texas for an example. I mean, you go from 45 abortion clinics to like 5 across the state that's like 800 miles long at one point. I mean, black women really have to get involved in this because this is affecting our health care. It's affecting everything about who we are. And whether you are pro-life or pro-choice, the fact that white men are making decisions about your body and what you do with it should be enough to take every woman to the polls in 2012, no matter what color you are. But I also think the biggest thing is we have to think about how do we make different kinds of coalitions. What was very interesting to me in Texas was that I looked across the pictures and how people looked and the crowd for when they were fighting SB 10 with Wendy, and that was a predominantly white crowd. Where were the African American women? I need to see
and
us
in Texas, Latinas, right?
Exactly.
I want a broad coalition.
Yes, I want a broad coalition, and that's what we have to start to think about it, that this is just not a black issue. This is an issue for all of us, but it's going to impact the African American community horribly.
Now, Karen, let me ask you that in part on the position of Essence, right? So obviously Essence is not a political magazine. It's a lifestyle magazine. But the issues that affect women of color are so frequently wrought in the political sphere. How an information source like Essence, what role does it play in moving women to the polls?
I think that Essence is absolutely critical to being part of the conversation, raising these issues about what's going on in our community, making sure that people have the information to make the right decisions at the polls, that they have complete information. That's what Essence, part of what we do provide is that resource. And because we speak to such a broad swath of African American women, Black Caribbean women, African women, we don't take that responsibility lightly at all.
Right, which is a reminder that immigration reform is also a women's issue, right? We talk about abortion and health care, child care, but we don't always remember that immigration is not just a Latina women's issue, right? It's a black women's issue.
Yes, absolutely. In a recent issue, we spoke to a woman, a black, undocumented immigrant, and talked to her about being seen and kind of unseen, but not being a part of that conversation. The conversation is always around border patrols. It's always around, English as a second language. What we forget is that there is a huge population that is contributing to this country, Black, Caribbean, and African, that are investing in this country, that they're paying taxes in this country, and yet we haven't invested in them.
Right, and we don't even think of the issue in that way. Karen, it is one thing to get voters out, right? So when I say 70% of black women showed up at the polls in 2012, but the other piece of this, if we're going to beat these kinds of restrictions, is women have to run. And so, as head of the Democratic Party here in a red state, how do we get more women, especially women in red states, to put their name in the hat?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Melissa. I mean, it's really embarrassing that I serve in the Louisiana State Senate and there are only 4 women out of 39 in the Senate, right? And then we wonder why the policies that come out of bodies like this are so, horribly impactful for women. You're right. But it's going to take working before we get to the presidential, as Alex mentioned. We're going to have to get into the state campaigns, legislative campaigns, and other local elections, because the folks that end up running for Congress and those higher offices ultimately come from school boards and state legislatures. And so it starts really at the bottom. And what we're doing in Louisiana with the Democratic Party is having training. And we're starting those. We've got something coming up in 2 weeks here in Louisiana. And so we're teaching them the things that you need to do before you jump out there. And more women are thinking about it now because there's so much at stake. It's a sacrifice.
I want to come back to you on exactly that issue as soon as we get back, in part because it looks like there may be some states that have been red states that could go blue. And so, here you are kind of fighting that out here. 4 women out of 39 in that body. That is something. Stay right there. We're going to be right back. And we've got more live from the Essence Festival here in New Orleans.